Tonight,
we're not looking for a broader war in the region.
The White House weighs how to respond after 3 U.S. service members were killed in a drone strike in Jordan. And as Senate lawmakers push a deal to protect the U.S. southern border, House Republicans push to impeach the Secretary of Homeland Security. Plus,
and when we dug into the reasons behind that disenchantment, what we find is some of the accusations we've probably heard in other settings.
Some of the common reasons people search for a new church. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The president draws top security officials to the Situation Room as the United States plans its response to a deadly drone strike. Good evening from the nation's capital. I'm Caitlin Burke, in for John and Jenna. The U.S. vows to respond after 3 U.S. soldiers were killed this weekend in a drone attack by an Iran-backed militia. It happened on a military base in Jordan near the Syrian border. The enemy drone reportedly mistaken for a U.S. craft. Today, the Pentagon identified the dead as Army Sergeant William Rivers, Specialist Kennedy Sanders, and Specialist Breonna Moffett. President Biden is still, quote, working through options after the attack, which also left 30 service members injured. Iran denies all involvement. Today, on his first day back in person from medical leave, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin addressed the first deaths of U.S. troops since the Israel-Hamas war began in October.
Let me start with my outrage and sorrow for the death of 3 brave U.S. troops in Jordan and for the other troops who were wounded. The President and I will not tolerate attack on U.S. forces, and we will take all necessary actions to defend the U.S. and our troops.
To date, there have been more than 160 Iran-backed attacks on Americans in Iraq and Syria, and so far the U.S. response has been limited, largely striking storage facilities. This major escalation in the region comes as the IDF released new footage of what it says are Israeli strikes on Hezbollah terror group targets in Lebanon. As the war in Gaza rages on, Israel Defense Forces in the south of Gaza seen here destroying a mosque and bulldozing through a cemetery to root out a Hamas tunnel network. With renewed fears of a widening war in the Middle East, negotiators from Israel, the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar have reportedly agreed on a framework for a new hostage deal. Reports say a draft of the deal is being presented to Hamas. Today, the White House was asked if responding to the attack on U.S. troops could complicate hostage negotiations.
There's no reason why our work on a hostage deal needs to be affected or impacted by what happened over the weekend or what we do about what happened over the weekend, and we will respond. We still want to keep the work going, our shoulder to the wheel on this hostage deal.
Meanwhile, protesters in Jerusalem continue to call for the release of the more than 100 hostages still held by Hamas. This week here in D.C., rabbis, pastors, and other Jewish and Christian leaders are coming together to advocate for Israel on Capitol Hill. Joining me now with more on that is Dr. Susan Michael, the U.S. Director of International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. Susan, what is the mission of this historic gathering on the Hill?
Well, we're going to be visiting with members of Congress and their staff and just encouraging them in their support of Israel during this war. We're going to be asking for their pressure on any party, such as Qatar, for the release of the hostages. Enough is enough. They are being tortured, and it's time to get them out of there. And we're going to be just encouraging continued support of Israel. This war is not going to end quickly. And so we want to make sure that the support of our government continues.
What are some of the other key topics that faith leaders will focus on as they have a chance to talk with lawmakers?
Well, first of all, we want them to understand that this is an American issue. This is not a sectarian issue, and that's why as Christians, we have bonded with the Jewish leaders to go with them together to demonstrate that we actually represent millions of grassroots American citizens, and this is important to them. Secondly, we will be saying, to continue to fund Israel and helping them and backing them up in this war, because it is a war it's a defensive war, It's a just war against an evil terrorist organization. And Israel is only doing what we would do ourselves if we were attacked like that. And we did after 9/11. And so we're calling for them to continue financial aid to Israel, which, by the way, is being held hostage to politics in both the House and the Senate. And so it's time that they just separate out aid to Israel and get it passed so that they can provide the support that Israel needs.
Having both Jewish and Christian leaders advocating for Israel as a united front is powerful. What impact do you hope that it has on lawmakers?
Well, I want you to know it's actually historic. And I know that there's been crossover with other advocacy days by different organizations where you may have a few Christians joining in with a Jewish group or vice versa. But this is the first time that this has been intentionally organized by rabbis and Christian leaders and pastors to come together to show a united front. And I think it also demonstrates that Israel understands who their real friends are, and their real friends is the Christian community. And so we want to demonstrate that friendship. We want the Jewish community to understand that we do stand with them. And it may look to them like the world is against them, but there are hundreds of millions of Bible-based Christians around the world that are praying for Israel, right, praying for the peace of Jerusalem, loving them. They're donating. And so we want this to be a very visible sign of that support.
All right, Dr. Susan Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Thank you.
Elsewhere on Capitol Hill, House Republicans have released articles of impeachment against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, setting up a committee vote later this week. The move by the GOP marks the first attempt to impeach a cabinet secretary in 150 years. It comes as a bipartisan group of senators plan to unveil a comprehensive border bill. CBN News White House correspondent Abigail Robertson joins us now for more on that. Abigail, what's behind the impeachment push?
Well, Caitlin, the two impeachment articles from Republicans on the Homeland Security Committee charge that Mayorkas has committed high crimes and misdemeanors by failing to comply with federal immigration laws amid the ongoing crisis at the southern border.
There has been a willful and refusal to comply with the law and an abuse of power.
The first article specifically accuses Mayorkas with willful and systemic refusal to comply with the law for repeatedly violating immigration and border security laws throughout his career. Article 2 charges include breach of public trust for knowingly making false statements and knowingly obstructing lawful oversight of DHS. The DHS claims the impeachment is unconstitutional and evidence-free, claiming Republicans don't want to fix the problem, they want to campaign on it. House Speaker Mike Johnson says the House will hold a vote on the articles of impeachment as soon as possible. Meanwhile, in the Senate, negotiators on the highly anticipated bipartisan border deal are signaling they have a deal and the text of the bill is almost ready.
This bill could be ready to be on the floor of the United States Senate next week.
But the bill's fate in both the Senate and House is uncertain as former President Trump speaks out against it on the campaign trail.
There is zero chance I will support this horrible open borders betrayal of America.
Senator James Lankford, the lead GOP negotiator, claims the deal makes dramatic changes to the immigration system and gives the commander-in-chief new authorities to take action at the border.
Do not have a vote count yet on this because everybody's got to be able to read it to be able to go through, but I do feel very positive about it because even the initial feedback has been good.
Even though the text of the bill has yet to be released, Oklahoma's Republican Party approved a resolution over the weekend condemning Senator Lankford for his role in the bipartisan border negotiations, claiming he's playing fast and loose with Democrats on border policy and putting the safety and security of Americans in danger. Caitlin?
Abigail, many House Republicans closely align with former President Trump. What do they make of the deal that's being negotiated?
Well, many of those House Republicans see Trump as the leader of the Republican Party, and they take their cues from him. And since he's strongly opposed to the bipartisan border deal, even though the text hasn't been unveiled yet, they're falling in line. And House Speaker Mike Johnson described the bill on Friday as dead on arrival in the House. And while Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell supports passing a border deal, he acknowledged last week two Republican senators that because of Trump's opposition, it's politically going to be really hard to get the GOP Senate support needed to get it across the finish line. And it's going to be even harder to pass it in the Republican-controlled House. Now, Senator Langford, who has been supportive of President Trump, and the former president even endorsed his last campaign, is encouraging everyone, including Trump, to read the text of the bill before speaking out against it just because of rumors they've heard about what's in it so far.
All right. Thanks, Abigail. With us now, David Beer, an Associate Director of Immigration Studies at Cato Institute. David, the president is vowing to shut down the border immediately if Congress passes a plan giving him the power to do it. Can you see that happening?
No, I can't. He had Title 42 authority to expel anyone who crossed the border during most of his presidency until May of 2023, when the Centers for Disease Control ended the pandemic era authority. It didn't matter. If you expel everyone who crosses to Mexico, what are they going to do on the other side of the river except try to cross the border again? And that's what we saw throughout this administration. We saw a lot of expulsions, but we also saw lots of people who were expelled try to recross the border again. And so there's really not an easy answer to immigration, of course, but the idea that, just reinstating this authority that he had for most of his term is going to be the game changer. I just don't see it.
As we just heard from Abigail, former President Trump is slamming this bipartisan deal in the Senate. Do you see that as Trump playing politics or a real interest in changing policy?
I don't know what is going on inside the former president's head. From my standpoint, he would have loved to have the authority to expel anyone who crossed the border during his term in office. He wanted changes to the asylum rules during his term in office. He was the one who originally instated Title 42. So I don't understand what his strategy is, but it certainly does not accord with how he behaved when he was in office. He knew that the law constrained the president and how he can respond to immigration. So this is certainly a change from his position in 2019 or 2018 or earlier.
In Texas, we're seeing a standoff with the federal government over a Supreme Court decision giving the feds the authority to remove razor wire that the state installed at the southern border. What do you make of that whole situation?
Political theater. I mean, you're talking about 3 miles of 2,000 miles of border, and this is where we're going to have a civil war. It really doesn't make sense that it's gotten to this point. This is just two politicians butting their heads, trying to, show who's boss. I wouldn't read too much into it. I think it's one of those situations where people are trying to make a point, and certainly the governor has. But the idea that this is the battleground for the future of the border is, I think, misguided. All the cameras focus on the one area where it's in dispute, ignoring the other 2,000 miles where, Border Patrol is operating as normal.
We've only got about 30 seconds left, but what is actually needed for some comprehensive immigration reform?
Look, we got to get control of the border, and the best way to do that is, of course, you got to have someone to catch criminals and threats crossing the border. Border Patrol is there to do that. But right now, we're spending so much of our time catching people who are just coming here to work. We need a legal immigration process for those people, so Border Patrol is freed up to secure the border.
All right, David Beer with the Cato Institute, thank you so much for your insights.
Of course, thank you.
Coming up, candidates turn their attention to South Carolina. The latest from the 2024 campaign trail right after this. Welcome back. The campaign trail is heating up for the current president and his predecessor. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump spent the weekend meeting with voters in key primary states. In Columbia, South Carolina, the president spoke during Sunday service at St. John Baptist Church, highlighting the transformational power of the Black church in America.
That's what the Black church has done for Black Americans imagine what would have happened if there'd been no Black church all those periods of darkness. Well, you give us a mountaintop, you give us a promised land, you give us a dream and a faith that we shall overcome, we can overcome. You know, and you push us toward a more perfect union, you really do.
President Biden's outreach to Black voters in South Carolina comes at a critical time for his re-election campaign, as he's losing a lot of support among that demographic. An AP Norc Center poll from last month found only 50% of Black adults say they approve of the president. In July of 2021, that number was 86%. Meanwhile, former President Trump was in Nevada ahead of that state's GOP caucuses next week. He drilled down on what's emerging as a top issue in the 2024 election: immigration.
Our border is open and gushing. It's a big gushing wound, letting drugs, crime, and millions upon millions of illegal aliens pour into our country like we've never seen before. Nothing like this has ever happened to our country before.
According to a recent Harvard Caps Harris survey, immigration has overtaken inflation as the top issue for potential voters. Finding where you fit. What's behind a rise in people searching for a new church home when Faith Nation returns. For Christians, it's common to have switched churches at some point. Now, new research shows it's happening more often. A recent Lifeway survey finds 60% make a change due to a move, while 40% give a variety of reasons. Jenna Browder reports on what churches can learn from this study.
This new study from Lifeway Research shows most churchgoers in the United States don't often switch churches, but sometimes it's necessary, whether it's moving to a new neighborhood or city or some other reason.
I think after churches opened back up, we, of course, went back to church, and I just began to feel like I needed something more.
Heather and Norm Edwards began to feel a disconnect attending a big church in the nation's capital.
I saw this at the church where we were on staff, and I see it at other larger churches where you literally can walk in, walk past everybody, and there's good, hey, welcome home, good morning. There's a lot of that, and it's kind and it's nice and the intentions are good, but you literally can go to your seat, not get to talk to anybody, go through the very professional, very well buttoned up service, both worship and message. And then there's a prayer and you walk out and you file out and it's, hey, thanks for coming. And you really haven't talked to anybody and you're just going straight home and that's it.
After COVID, they wanted more community and something smaller. They also wanted sermons with deeper spiritual meaning and not as topical.
We do surveys on the church and the culture with the desire to inform church leaders of what's happening and so that they can make better informed ministry decisions.
The Lifeway study shows 40% of these church switchers are like Heather and Norm, who change for reasons other than moving locations. Of this group, researchers found 3 major takeaways. Either something changed about the church they didn't like, the church didn't fulfill their needs, or respondents became disenchanted with the pastor or the church.
And when we dug into the reasons behind that disenchantment, what we find is some of the accusations we've probably heard in other settings that the church was judgmental, the church was hypocritical, sometimes pointing at the pastor not being a good preacher.
Executive Director Scott McConnell says the data reveals an opportunity for churches to think about their approach and be more outward focused.
So I've been serving as a pastor altogether now about 7 years. and am really grateful for the call to serve God in this way.
Pastor Alex Young leads Crossroads Presbyterian in Northern Virginia. When asked what he sees, Young says it usually comes down to 3 categories. Drift, Christians leaving churches that no longer follow the Bible. Disinterest, people losing their faith and leaving. Or disagreement, Christians leaving one church for another. He sees this as the most common.
All Christians, I think, hold those same core beliefs in common. But on these secondary issues, there's disagreement.
Those issues being things like baptism, church government, interpretation of certain scriptures, and others.
I think church is about community. It's about doing this life together. So we're encouraging each other, holding each other accountable. We're there for each other. And we didn't really have that in that bigger setting.
Heather and Norm now attend a smaller church in Northern Virginia. They say is a great fit.
And it certainly is not as polished or professional, but that's not really what matters to us. It's the authenticity in the community.
And that may be the bottom line, finding the right church for you, where you can best walk with Him and continue growing in your faith. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Still ahead, the full circle moment behind an emotional reunion. Next on Faith Nation. Finally tonight, a reunion nearly 3 decades in the making, as a New York City police officer met the men who inspired her to help people, just like they had done for her years earlier. It was a full circle moment for Officer Denise Gomez as she came face to face with the detectives that saved her life. When Gomez was 2, she and her family were trapped in a burning car. These 2 detectives stepped in and saved them. Even though she was just a toddler, their bravery inspired her to do what she does today. In fact, now that her heroes are retired, Gomez even wears one of their old numbers, saying she'll do her best to make the hero detectives proud. I'm sure that was a great moment for all the officers involved. Thanks for joining us tonight for Faith Nation. We will see you tomorrow.